Hi everyone, it's me again, KP, and I'm here in my studio, The Moon and the Maker, and I'm here for another demo and lesson for our Imperfect journal. And so we are going to broach the subject of portraits, self-portraits, and doing something I like to call the imperfect self-portrait. So I know a lot of people probably, groan when they hear self-portrait, but I do want to let you know there's way more ways to do a self-portrait than you may think. And I think we're going to actually do a couple different self-portraits, but this is going to be our first one. Keep in mind there are different, like I said, different types of self-portraits. So there's literal or realistic self-portraits, and there's also representational self-portraits, abstracted self-portraits, and illustrated self-portraits, which would be more like caricatures or cartoons. So there's a lot of different ways, and you can even make a self-portrait without an actual image or picture of yourself. In my design class, we made a representational self-portrait that was three-dimensional, that just was made up of things that we felt we were made up of. Does that make sense? So, you could even do a collage page. If you do not feel comfortable drawing or painting yourself, you could do a collage page of things that you feel represent you. And that is a sort of self-portrait in and of itself. But in this case, we are going to do one like this for our demo and page, our journal page today. I do want to start out with just a little quote from our Love for Imperfect Things, because this little quote right here was one of the reasons I decided to include a self-portrait, because I think it is important to broach the subject for self-growth and just introspection. So this one says, even products labeled limited edition are made on a production line with hundreds that are exactly the same, but there's only one you in the world. Please cherish the unique individual that is you. So that is what we're doing when we do a self-portrait. And it does not have to be a glamorous, beautiful self-portrait. It can be something very sort of, folk artsy and rough. I am going to be using a photograph, and so we're going to make it easy on ourselves. And I took a photo of me. It wasn't like my favorite photo in the world, but I liked that I didn't really have a smile. I thought it might make it easier. Excuse me. And you'll notice that I even had a wrinkled dress on and sort of a busy background, but that's okay. I went ahead and converted it to black and white. Even though the photo was not taken in black and white, I converted it to black and white, and I printed it just on some satin photo paper. Okay, if I would have had matte photo paper, I probably would have used that, but I didn't have any. So really, whatever you have. Glossy may make it a little more challenging to paint on, but so I do recommend either matte or like a satin. But if glossy is all you got, then that's okay. You could also photocopy it, or keep in mind, if you don't have the capabilities to, drag your photo into your computer and print it out that way, you can always just use an actual photo that was taken of you, if you have any from when we actually used to get our film developed. So there's lots of ways that you can go about this, but I would just recommend finding a picture of you that you feel will be fairly simple to paint. I, again, converted it to black and white to make it easier and just to get my base layer and make shadows, okay? So remember, again, I'm going to go over here to my journal. I went ahead and bound it together now, and I'm just going to start filling in pages, okay? And I felt like, go ahead and check out the journal so far. I think I've already shared it with you a couple times, but that's how it's looking right now. So this is, again, 5 by 7, but that's because of my size of my journal. So, it's going to depend on what size your journal is, of what size photo that you use. And of course, you could always also print it out, whatever size, and cut it down if you have a smaller journal. Oh, goodness. That's a lot of explaining. Anyway, so this is where my page is going to go. And obviously this background, I don't know if I'll want to go ahead and do some other things to it. I think that I do. I think I'm going to want to stamp it a little bit or do something decorative, but this is where I'm going to put it. Okay, so I think that'll be great. And of course, I'll take pictures and share them on the page and in our group as well. But let's go ahead and get started. So a few things that you'll need: some white gesso. The colors that I'll recommend for your skin tone, unless you want to do it crazy and do, you know, some wild colors, is burnt sienna, because burnt sienna you can really, by mixing this with a little bit of white or keeping it fairly straight, you can get any skin tone. Now, if you want a darker skin tone, even than this, you could use a little bit of like Van Dyke brown to mix with it, but I would still probably end up mixing a little bit of white. Anyway, but burnt sienna is great for many skin tones across the whole spectrum, and especially then if you want to mix it with a little bit of white. And then alizarin crimson is great for cheek color or lip color and things like that. So these are the three colors that I would definitely recommend. And then in white gesso, although I wouldn't call it a color, but and then whatever other colors that you're going to want that that are your colors that coordinate with what you're doing and what how you would want to paint your background. And then I'm going to recommend a couple brushes, like some little flat or not little, but flat shader brush and a larger flat shader brush is what I use, and possibly another smaller little detail brush. Mixed media brushes if you can. These are more specifically for acrylic paint, not for watercolor, so they're a little firmer, have a little bit more spring to them, not quite so soft. And again, I will be using acrylic paints. I have some heavy body acrylic paints. Okay, and then a couple, and of course I do have a little bit of my fluorescent pink that I love, and a little bit of fluid acrylics. These colors, yellow and a blue. Another important one that you're definitely going to want is your shading gray. Okay, shading gray. And then I used, instead of a black, I used my Payne's gray. And last but not least, I also used a little bit of my chartreuse in my high flow. Okay, that was it. So I really have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 5 fluid acrylics, 2 high flow acrylics, 3 heavy body acrylics, and 1 white gesso. Excuse me, 1 white gesso. And then these 3 brushes, of course, I have a little mat here at the ready and some fresh paper towels and some water on my table. A few rubber stamps are going to come into play from my Imperfection collection. I have the Embrace Your Imperfection stamp, this like Imperfect tulips, and then my Happy Thoughts text stamp. And I did use a little skinny sort of ballpoint pen, okay? Just for a little detail, but no big deal. All right, let's get started. I started with my larger flat shader. The cool thing about using a photo of yourself too is, of course, you can also use this for reference for other things. You could do transfers, you can make photocopies, but it also just is a great, especially like I said, when you start with a black and white background, or I mean with a black and white photo, it makes a great base layer. And I'm just working with a dry brush, dipping straight into my gesso, and I'm going to paint out the background. I don't want it too thick, and I do want to try to coat the whole thing, even my outer edges. I might miss in a couple spots, and that's okay. I am going for a pretty mixed media look. So it can be just sort of brush strokey. And I'm going to go ahead and paint even on the white, just to give it not only a little tooth and a little texture. It's going to make it a nicer surface to sort of stamp on, and then it'll also give it the same look in the background when I go to paint on another layer. Now, of course, keep in mind if you have something really cool in the background, like a beautiful scenery or something like that, a beautiful landscape or something, maybe you do not want to paint it out. Maybe you want to paint over that and actually leave some of the background in your painting. But that's kind of the cool thing, is that you get to decide and have whatever you want back there. You can make electric colors. You could do all kinds of stamping. You could stamp words. Oh, like I say every time, the possibilities are truly endless. So super fun. Like I said, that's just going to give it a little bit of tooth and some nice texture for my future layers. All right, so I already have some burnt sienna squeezed out here, okay? And so I'm going to go ahead and just get some white gesso on my little palette. And I'm going to mix a little bit of burnt sienna with my white gesso, just to get sort of my skin tone, or the skin tone that I want. And now I'm cleaning off my brush again, and I'm just leaving my little mixture right there. And one thing that I'm going to do that's sort of a little helpful tip is I'm going to get some plain white gesso on my brush, and again, sort of a dry brush. I don't have a wet brush. I cleaned it out really well and dried it out really well. And I'm going to sort of hit a couple of the spots on the photo right now of the highlights where the lightest points are on me. So that's my shoulders, a little bit my collarbone, my cheekbones. And this one's a little much back here, so I did sort of get my brush kind of wet, and I'm gonna try to pull a little bit of that back out. Oh well, doesn't matter. Okay, and I'm gonna squeeze out a little bit. Well, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. Never mind. I'm gonna dip back in here to my mixture that I made, and I'm just gonna start painting lightly across my face. And I'm working with, again, sort of a dry brush, thin layers, so I can still sort of see through to that under layer, okay? And I'm just gonna do that all over. It's gonna look weird for a while, trust me, okay? Just be patient and add little layers, and we're gonna build up. And again, it's okay if it's brush strokey, if you see lines in it. All right, so I got a little layer on the skin tone there, and now I'm going to take my white gesso again. Again, pretty dry brush. And I'm going to Painting my dress. Get rid of all those wrinkles. As you can see on my dress, I have a little bit of texture around the collar and around the sleeve, so I'm sort of letting some of that stay and show through. I'm not painting it super thick. I'd rather build up sort of slow layers. And what's kind of cool is, as you can see, the darks of the photograph are actually creating my outlines, okay? I can go in again I'm just using sort of that flat tip of my brush, and I can go in and add some little highlights real softly. And I just keep going back, like back and back and back, and adding little touches at a time, okay? And believe it or not, though, it still doesn't, it's not going to take me like hours and hours. This is going to, once we start, you know, getting it a little bit more built up, it'll go by pretty quick. Again, just going back over with a little more white gesso here. And now for my hair, I'm going to use a little bit of Payne's Gray. But the fun thing about the hair is you could really use any color, okay? If you wanted a light color, if you have a light color hair, then I probably would lay down a little bit of gesso and then paint it a lighter color. But of course, what's fun is that with the hair colors, you could even do pinks, you could do blues, you could do rainbow, whatever you want. But I'm just going to stick with this dark hair, and I'm just going to use a little bit of Payne's Gray. And the next thing I'm going to do also is I'm going to use my little smaller, more detail-y brush, and I'm going to use that Payne's Gray. And I'm going to go in and work on my eyes just a little bit and kind of give them a little shading and darkness. My eyebrows too. Gotta make them match. Maybe a little bit through the lips. The nostrils, all, wherever it's really super dark, okay? I'm going to use a little tiny bit of gesso again here on the lips. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of white gesso again and hopefully I can just sort of dot the eye the tiniest bit. A more dark burnt sienna maybe for just a little of the deeper color. My brush is really dry and I'm just dragging a little bit of darker color through some of these areas. I'm just using the tiniest bit just for some depth. I'm going to wet my brush a little and sort of move that paint just a tiny bit. Really helps with the shading. But again, I'm being very light-handed. Okay, and so I'm now going to take my shading gray. This is really an important part of this. Remember, your high flow acrylics are the only ones that really need to be shaken. But again, shading gray is very translucent and it's going to be perfect. Again, not wetting my brush, but this is very watery and loose. But I'm going to go in and really give myself some nice shadows and sort of go over it where you already had those natural shadows. Something, if you don't like what you do, you can sort of get a thirsty brush by cleaning your brush really well and using it to sort of getting it dry and using it to sort of mop up a little bit. But I'm using my shading gray sort of in all these little recessed dark areas. Okay, and so now I'm going to hit my background and I'm going to take my bigger brush again, this one that I gessoed with, and I'm going to dry it out really well. And I'm going to use my manganese blue. Really anything that you have that's sort of translucent should be nice, unless you want it real dark and opaque, and then of course you can use whatever you like. But I'm going to go in with this manganese blue and just sort of, again, I'm not worried about brush strokes or anything like that. One thing that you do want to make sure is that your white gesso is good and dry before you do this. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of bald spots because it'll just pull it right up. And I'm already having a little bit of trouble with that since I'm kind of going back over stuff. I don't know. It's okay though, because I am going to cover it up with some stamping. So obviously if you want that smoother, you can work on it a little more, let your gesso dry better and give it a few coats if you care about it being nice and smooth, but I'm not going to worry about it too much because like I said, I'm going to be doing some over stamping. I do want to go in now with a little bit of my alizarin crimson hue, and just I need barely the tiniest drop. I'm going to also use my detail brush and work on my lips just a little bit. Oh, back to my shading gray just a little. So, you're just going to go in and see the spots that maybe you need to finesse a little bit, and you're just going to go back and forth, giving highlights where you feel like you might need a little bit. Smoothing stuff out if you need some gradients. I'm going to give myself a tiny bit of alizarin crimson also in the cheeks, just a little bit. Now if I got a little heavy-handed, I can always water down my brush and just give a nice little back to my shading gray. All right, so that's looking good to me. Now I am going to, well, a little bit more care, I think, around this collar area. So it can be really rough, you know, don't feel like you need to like be stuck in the details. Just keep adding little layers. You see where I just keep skipping around. I'm dipping in. I actually have this color already squeezed onto my palette, but it is a heavy body, and it's just a little bit of like an aqua color that I had laying around. But I'm going to use that as a base layer on my dress. Again, dry brushing is important. I don't want a lot of water on this photograph for one thing, and it just seems to stick a little bit better and grab better. That's why I use the gesso as opposed to white acrylic paint, is it does have a little bit more of a tooth and a texture. So now I'm going to go ahead and just take my tulip stamp, I think. Well, no, actually I have a couple more little things I want to do. I'm going to use my little pen here to sort of outline my necklace and then also, and just gave it the slightest little sort of squiggly line there. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of just pattern in that. No big deal. I'm going to use a little bit of my fluorescent pink. Hooray. And paint in my little necklace. Just give the slightest little, again, reflected color, because we're going to have a little bit of this pink in the background. So a very small amount there with a dry brush again. And I'm going to actually grab another brush in my light green shade here. And I'm just going to paint my stamp. This brush actually is a little too big, so I'm going to try to find another flat shader that's a little smaller. But this should give me at least a stamping or two. I'm not going to worry about if it's perfect or even if it's that good. I'm just going to stamp and paint and stamp a few times. If I can get more than one stamping, that'll be great. But I'm not sure if I can, because my stamp is pretty grunged up right about now. All right, now I'm going to take my little Happy Thoughts text stamp here. Some white gesso. Didn't get a very good stamping of the words, but it's okay. I'm going to let that dry, and as it's drying, I guess I'll go ahead and clean up this mess. I think I'm pretty much done with my green for now. Just darkening up the hair again. And now I think I'm going to take my chartreuse. And I only call out the colors just so you know what I'm doing. But of course, I want you to, you know, choose the colors that call to you, of course, definitely. So maybe you don't like the super brights the way I do. Maybe you want earth tones or reds. But definitely this all has to dry. I'm just kind of going on to some of the parts that I know are dry. Just always remember there's going to be some reflected color, so, oops. Ah, don't go crazy with it. I hate when that happens. Going along so nicely and make a little boo-boo that I have to then try to fix up. All right, and then I'm going to take my Embrace Your Imperfection stamp and see if it'll even stick to a mount anymore. It's getting pretty well loved. I'm going to use the manganese blue and a little bit of the Payne's gray. Maybe do a little bit of a gradient. Not the best stamping of my life, but it's okay. I am actually going to use my brush to touch it up just the tiniest bit. Not because I care about it being perfect, but because I do want it to be readable. All right, and ta-da! And I'll then decide which one I actually like better. I don't know, I'll have to look at them sort of. I think I still like this one better to decide which one I want to put in my journal. This one I feel like might still need just a tiny bit of work, but you get the idea. So I can't wait to see your imperfect self-portrait. And then we are also, keep in mind, going to play with some other ideas for other imperfect self-portraits, because there's just so many possibilities. So we'll take a look at another one in our next video. Thanks for joining me, and I can't wait to work on our next pages. Have a perfectly imperfect day, my friends. Thanks for joining me, and see you soon.